You told me something strange has been happening lately. You keep feeling like your life is waiting for something to start. You're telling me you've been thinking about the same changes for a long time now. The things you want to do. The decisions you've been putting off. The direction you keep imagining but haven't moved toward yet. You remember those moments when the thought comes back, don't you? Usually when you're alone. When things are quiet. When you suddenly realize how much time has passed while you were still standing in the same place. You said you keep telling yourself you'll do it soon. Soon you'll change something. Soon you'll start living the way you actually want. Soon you'll stop waiting. But somehow that moment keeps moving further away. You're telling me there's always something that needs to happen first. Maybe you need more stability. Maybe the timing has to be right. Maybe other people need to understand. Maybe you just need to be more ready. I understand why that feels reasonable. Because when a decision affects your life, it's natural to want everything to line up perfectly before you take the step. But there's something else you noticed, isn't there? The moment when you realized you've been waiting for a very long time. Waiting for things to feel easier. Waiting for someone to support the decision. Waiting for the situation to change. And slowly, without really planning it, your life started feeling like something that will begin later. Not now. Later. You told me this didn't start suddenly. It built up slowly. At first it felt reasonable. You said you just needed to be patient. There were things to figure out first. Situations that had to settle down before you could really focus on your own life. You remember telling yourself that, don't you? Well, once things are more stable, then I'll start making the changes. Once work feels secure. Once the timing is better. Once everyone around me understands. You kept telling yourself the same thing. Just not yet. Look, I understand why that sounded responsible at the time. When a decision affects your life, it feels safer to wait until everything lines up. It feels thoughtful to make sure no one else is negatively affected. It feels careful to avoid doing something that might create conflict. So you waited. And while you were waiting, something subtle started happening. You began checking other people first. You're telling me you started thinking about their reactions before you even made the decision for yourself. Whether they would approve. Whether they would understand. Whether they would support what you wanted to do. You remember doing that, don't you? Sometimes you even imagined the conversation before it happened. You rehearsed what you would say. You tried to explain the decision in a way that would make it easier for them to accept. And if you imagined resistance, you hesitated. Not because the decision was wrong. Because you didn't want to create tension. So you adjusted the plan. Maybe later. Maybe when things are calmer. Maybe when the timing feels easier for everyone involved. Maybe. You probably told yourself that was the mature thing to do. Well, I understand why you thought that. Most of us are taught to consider everyone else before we consider ourselves. We're taught to avoid conflict. To keep the peace. To make decisions that other people will feel comfortable with. But let's slow this down for a second. Something else was forming at the same time. Before making a decision about your own life, you looked around to see how others might react. Before taking a step forward, you waited to see if someone would approve. Before trusting what you wanted, you checked whether it would be acceptable. And after repeating that enough times, something quiet begins to happen. Your life stops feeling like something you are directing. It starts feeling like something you are waiting to be allowed to live. You told me you kept waiting for the right moment. The moment when everything would feel clearer. The moment when the situation around you would finally settle down enough for you to make a decision about your own life. Well, I understand why that sounded reasonable at the time. When something affects your future, of course you want to be careful. Of course you want to make sure you're not creating problems for yourself or for the people around you. But look, something else was quietly hiding inside that explanation. You weren't only waiting for the right moment. You were waiting for the moment when the decision would stop feeling uncomfortable. You're telling me you kept thinking the same thing again and again. Once things calm down, I'll do it. Once the situation becomes easier, I'll move forward. Once people understand what I'm trying to do, then I'll finally start living the way I want. You remember telling yourself that, don't you? Because saying later makes the pressure disappear for a while. If the decision belongs to the future, you don't have to face it today. You can tell yourself the situation simply needs more time. And this is where the illusion slowly takes shape. You start believing the reason nothing is changing is because the timing still isn't right. Because the circumstances aren't ready yet. Because something outside you still needs to shift before your life can finally begin. But here's the difficult part. The timing was never the real obstacle. The decision was. Because making that decision would mean accepting something uncomfortable. No one is going to arrive and give you permission to live your life. No one is going to step in and say the moment has finally come. And once you see that clearly, the waiting starts to look different. It wasn't patience. It was avoidance. You told me something started changing the moment you looked at the situation more honestly. Not because the circumstances suddenly improved, and not because someone finally gave you an answer. It changed because you stopped assuming the permission had to come from somewhere else. Look, that realization doesn't usually arrive all at once. At first it's just a small shift in the way you see things. Moments that used to feel confusing start making more sense when you look at them from a different angle. Situations that once felt complicated suddenly begin to look much simpler. You're telling me that when you think about it now, the pattern becomes easier to see. For a long time you believed the waiting was about timing. You thought the situation around you needed to settle first. You told yourself you just needed the right moment, the right circumstances, the right amount of stability before making the decisions you had been thinking about. Well, let's slow this down for a second. When you look back now, something else becomes visible. Each time you felt the urge to move forward, you paused and looked around first. You checked how other people might react. You wondered whether they would understand. You asked yourself whether the decision would be accepted. You remember doing that, don't you? Instead of asking yourself what you wanted, you began asking what would be acceptable. Instead of trusting your own direction, you waited to see whether someone else might confirm it first. And slowly, without really planning it, that became the way you approached your own life. I understand why that happened. Most of us grow up learning to be careful with our choices. We learn to avoid creating tension. We learn to consider how our decisions might affect other people before we consider how they affect us. But here's the interesting part. After repeating that pattern long enough, something subtle begins to happen. Your life starts feeling like something that needs approval. Like something that must be justified before it can begin. But look, once you see that pattern clearly, the situation stops being confusing. The permission you were waiting for was never actually outside of you. And once that becomes obvious, the waiting begins to look very different. Because the moment you've been expecting isn't something that arrives. It's something you decide to step into. You told me something feels different now. Not because your life suddenly changed overnight, and not because someone finally stepped in and gave you an answer. It feels different because the waiting doesn't make the same sense anymore. Look, once you see the pattern clearly, it becomes difficult to pretend you don't notice it. For a long time you believed the right moment would eventually arrive. You thought the circumstances around you simply needed to settle before you could finally move forward. You're telling me now that something about that explanation doesn't feel convincing anymore. You probably repeated the same thoughts many times. Once things calm down, I'll do it. Once the timing is better, I'll finally start living the way I want. Well, that belief protected you for a while. If the moment belonged to the future, you didn't have to face the decision today. I understand why that felt safer. But here's the part that slowly became harder to ignore. The days kept passing, the situation around you kept moving, and the life you were waiting to begin stayed exactly where it was. You remember noticing that, don't you? That strange feeling that time was moving faster than your decisions. That quiet realization that the moment you were expecting never seemed to arrive. And once you see that clearly, something important becomes obvious. No one is going to appear and hand you permission to live your life. No one is going to step in and announce that the moment has finally come. Because the moment you were waiting for doesn't arrive from somewhere else. It appears the moment you decide you're done waiting. If you decide to.